David Sterling had always been the guy who asked the tough questions. Even as a kid, he drove his Sunday school teachers crazy by pointing out things that didn't make sense in Bible stories. While other children colored pictures of Noah's Ark, David was wondering how all those animals fit on one boat and where they went to the bathroom. By the time he reached college, David had completely walked away from religion. He studied philosophy and psychology, diving deep into books about critical thinking and logical fallacies. His professors loved him because he could spot weak arguments from a mile away. His family? Well, that was a different story. Holiday. Dinners became awkward affairs where David would politely but firmly challenge his relatives' beliefs about prayer and miracles. After graduation, David started small. He began with a podcast in his tiny apartment, talking to his laptop microphone about why he thought religion was holding humanity back. His first episodes had maybe 12 listeners, and half of them were probably his college friends feeling sorry for him. But David had something special. He could explain complicated ideas in ways that regular people understood. He wasn't just smart. He was smart in a way that made others feel smart too. The podcast grew slowly at first. David would spend hours researching televangelists who owned private jets while asking their followers for money. He'd break down the psychology behind why people believed in things like healing crystals or astrology. His audience loved how he could take apart these beliefs without being mean about it. Well, mostly without being mean. Then came the big break. A local radio station offered David a late-night slot. The show was called Sterling Truth, and it became the place where people went to hear someone say out loud what they'd been thinking, privately. David had a gift for finding the exact moment when spiritual leaders contradicted themselves. He'd play audio clips of famous preachers saying one thing on Sunday and something completely different on Monday. The show's success caught everyone off guard, including David himself. Within 2 years, Sterling Truth was being broadcast in major cities across the country. David moved from his cramped apartment to a decent studio, and suddenly he had a real production team. His audience wasn't just college students and angry ex-religious people anymore. He was reaching truck drivers, office workers, stay-at-home parents, and retired folks who tuned in every night. What made David different from other atheist commentators was his research. He didn't just attack random religious people. He went after the big targets, the ones who claimed to speak for God while living in mansions and flying in private jets. He exposed fake healers who took advantage of desperate sick people. He called out religious leaders who preached about family values while having affairs. His audience respected him because he seemed to genuinely care about protecting people from being taken advantage of. But success started changing David in ways he didn't notice at first. The angrier he got during his show, the more his audience loved it. Comments and emails poured in praising him for destroying this religious leader or obliterating that spiritual guru. David found himself playing up the drama, raising his voice more, using sharper language. The quiet, thoughtful philosophy student was slowly becoming a performance artist of outrage. His team started suggesting bigger targets. Why go after unknown? Televangelists when he could take on celebrities. Hollywood stars who talked about finding God or discovering spirituality were perfect material. They had huge followings, which meant huge ratings when David took them down. It was a business decision that made perfect sense. That's when Keanu Reeves appeared on a morning talk show. David was having his usual Monday morning coffee scrolling through entertainment news to find material for that week's shows. He almost skipped past the interview clip, but something made him click play. There was Keanu sitting comfortably across from the host talking about his latest movie. Normal stuff. But then the conversation shifted. The host asked Keanu how he dealt with all the tragedy in his life. Losing his best friend River Phoenix, his daughter, his longtime partner. David expected the usual Hollywood response about therapy and staying positive. Instead, Keanu started talking about Buddhist teachings, about meditation, about finding peace through accepting that suffering is part of life. David leaned forward in his chair. This wasn't the typical celebrity spiritual nonsense he was used to hearing. Keanu wasn't selling anything. He wasn't promoting a book or a guru or a lifestyle brand. He was just quietly explaining how certain ideas helped him cope with real pain. But David's trained eye caught what he saw as inconsistencies and contradictions. This is perfect, David muttered to himself, already imagining the segment he could create. He spent the next 3 days gathering material. Every interview where Keanu mentioned spirituality or meditation, photos of him visiting temples, stories about his charitable work that David could frame as publicity stunts. He even found old interviews where Keanu talked about questioning everything, which David planned to contrast with his current spiritual phase. The research process excited David in a way he hadn't felt in months. This wasn't going to be another takedown of an obvious fraud. This was going to be different. Keanu Reeves was beloved by millions of people. He had a reputation as one of the genuinely good guys in Hollywood. Taking him down would prove that David could see through anyone's act, no matter how convincing. David's production team was thrilled when he pitched the idea. Keanu was trending on social media that week anyway because of some kind gesture he'd made to a fan. The timing couldn't be better. They blocked out an entire hour-long episode, promoted it heavily on social media, and even created graphics with Keanu's face surrounded by question marks. As the show date approached, David felt the familiar rush of anticipation. He rehearsed his talking points, practiced his delivery, and fine-tuned every joke. He imagined his audience's reaction, the social media buzz, the clips that would go viral. This was going to be the episode that took sterling truth to the next level. What David didn't realize was that he was about to encounter something he'd never faced before in his career as a professional skeptic. He was about to meet someone who would challenge not his atheism, but something much deeper. His assumption that anyone who talked about spiritual matters was either fooling others or fooling themselves. The night before the show, David felt unusually confident. He had his notes, his clips, and his arguments all lined up. Everything was ready for what he believed would be his most brilliant takedown yet. He went to bed early, set his alarm, and prepared to wake up and destroy one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. He had no idea that instead of destroying Keanu Reeves's reputation, he was about to begin a journey that would transform his own life in ways he never could have imagined. The red on-air light flickered on, and David Sterling felt that familiar surge of energy coursing through his veins. His studio audience was packed tonight, word having spread about his special episode targeting one of Hollywood's most beloved actors. The chat room was already buzzing with anticipation, and his social media notifications were going crazy. "Good evening, truth seekers," David began, his voice carrying that perfect mix of authority and casual confidence that had made him famous. "Tonight, we're going to talk about something that's been bothering me all week. We're going to talk about fake spirituality, Hollywood hypocrisy, and how even the nicest guys in the business can fool millions of people." He clicked his first slide, and Keanu Reeves' face appeared on the screen behind him. The audience murmured with interest. This wasn't what they'd expected. David usually went after obvious targets: the televangelists with gold teeth and private jets, the self-help gurus selling miracle cures. But Keanu? Everyone loved Keanu. "Now I know what you're thinking," David continued, pacing across his small stage like a lawyer addressing a jury. "This guy seems different, right? He's humble, he's generous, he doesn't flaunt his wealth, he gives money to charity, he's polite to fans, he even rides the subway like a regular person. But here's the thing, folks. That's exactly what makes him so dangerous." David had spent days crafting this opening, and he could tell it was working. The audience was leaning forward, curious about where he was going with this. His online viewers were already sharing clips on social media, and the episode had barely started. "Let me show you what I mean," David said, clicking to his first video clip. It was from Keanu's recent morning show appearance, the one that had started this whole thing. The audio quality was crystal clear as Keanu's soft voice filled the studio. "I've found that meditation helps me deal with loss," Keanu was saying on screen. "Buddhist teachings about impermanence, about accepting that everything changes, that suffering is part of life, these ideas bring me peace." David paused the video and turned back to his audience with a knowing smile. "Peace," he says. "Let me ask you something. Does this look like a man who's found peace?" He clicked through a series of photos. Keanu looking sad at movie premieres, Keanu sitting alone on park benches, Keanu with tired eyes and candid street photos. David had chosen each image carefully to tell the story he wanted to tell. "This is a man who's been carrying grief for decades," David said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "His daughter died before she was born. His girlfriend died in a car accident. His best friend overdosed when they were young. And instead of getting real help, professional therapy, proven treatments for trauma and depression, he's turned to ancient superstitions." The audience was silent now, hanging on every word. David knew he had them exactly where he wanted them. "But here's where it gets really problematic," he continued, warming up to his main argument. "When celebrities like this talk about finding answers in religion or spirituality, they're not just fooling themselves. They're influencing millions of fans who look up to them. They're telling people that meditation and ancient wisdom can solve real problems that require real solutions." David played another clip, this one from an older interview where Keanu talked about visiting temples and finding wisdom in Buddhist texts. As the video played, David provided his own commentary like a sports announcer calling a game. "Notice how he talks about ancient wisdom like it's some kind of secret knowledge," David said over the audio. "This is classic spiritual bypassing, folks. Instead of dealing with his trauma through evidence-based treatment, he's escaped into mystical thinking." The online chat was exploding with comments. Some viewers were defending Keanu, but most were agreeing with David's analysis. The hashtag #DrawingSterlingTruth was already trending on Twitter, with clips from the show being shared thousands of times. David spent the next 20 minutes systematically deconstructing every aspect of Keanu's public statements about spirituality. He played clips out of context, highlighted what he called contradictions, and questioned the actor's motives for discussing his beliefs publicly. "Look at this," David said, showing a photo of Keanu donating money to a children's hospital. "Beautiful gesture, right? But notice the timing. This donation happened right after he gave that interview about Buddhist compassion. Coincidence? I don't think so." The audience gasped. David was suggesting that even Keanu's charitable work was calculated for publicity, timed to support his spiritual image. It was a bold claim, and David knew it. But controversy drove ratings, and ratings drove success. "And let's talk about the meditation thing," David continued, clicking to a new slide. "He claims that sitting quietly and focusing on his breath helps him find inner peace. But meditation is just organized daydreaming. Folks, it's a way to avoid dealing with real problems by pretending you can think your way out of them." David had prepared statistics about therapy versus meditation, studies about the effectiveness of different treatments for grief and trauma. He presented the data with the confidence of a college professor, making his audience feel smart for seeing through what he called Hollywood spirituality. But David was just getting warmed up. He'd saved his best material for the second half of the show. "Here's what really bothers me about this whole thing," he said, his voice rising with practiced indignation. "When regular people are suffering, when they're dealing with loss and trauma and depression, we tell them to see doctors, to get therapy, to take medication if they need it. But when a rich celebrity talks about finding answers in ancient books and meditation cushions, we act like that's profound wisdom." The audience was nodding along, caught up in David's rhythm. He could feel their energy matching his own. That electric connection between performer and crowd that made live television so addictive. David played his final clip, a compilation he'd created of Keanu talking about different spiritual concepts over the years. He'd edited it to make the actor's beliefs sound contradictory and confused, jumping from Buddhism to general spirituality to philosophical questioning. As the montage played, David provided his own soundtrack of commentary and criticism. "This is a man who's been searching for answers in all the wrong places," David concluded as the clip ended. "And instead of admitting that his approach isn't working, he's doubled down on it. He's become a poster boy for the idea that you can meditate your way out of real psychological problems." The show ended with David's signature closing, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone as he looked directly into the camera. "I don't hate Keanu Reeves," he said. "I actually feel sorry for him. He's a victim of his own spiritual delusions, and he doesn't even realize it. But when victims become promoters of the same thinking that's keeping them trapped, that's when we have to speak up. That's when we have to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. As the credits rolled, David felt the familiar high of a successful show. The phones were already ringing with interview requests from other media outlets. His social media was exploding with shares and comments. The episode was going viral in real time, exactly as he'd hoped. What David didn't know was that somewhere in Los Angeles, Keanu Reeves was watching the show too. And unlike David's previous targets, who usually responded with anger or lawsuits or public denials, Keanu was planning something completely different. Something that would catch David completely off guard and change everything he thought he knew about the man he'd just spent an hour trying to destroy. David Sterling woke up the next morning expecting the usual aftermath of a controversial show. His phone would be buzzing with interview requests from entertainment blogs. His social media would be flooded with both praise and angry comments. Maybe there'd be a strongly worded statement from Keanu's publicist, or better yet, a threat from some expensive Hollywood lawyer. That's how these things usually went. Instead, David found something that made him sit up in bed and stare at his phone screen in complete confusion. His assistant had forwarded him an email that came through the show's official contact form around 3 in the morning. The subject line was simple: a conversation if you're interested. What made David's heart skip a beat was the sender's name, and the verification that it was actually legitimate. The email was short and polite, nothing like what David had expected. There were no angry accusations, no demands for retractions, no legal threats. Instead, it was an invitation that David had never received in his 10 years of hosting Sterling Truth. "I watched your show last night," the email began. "I understand you have concerns about the things I've said publicly regarding spirituality and meditation. Rather than respond through media or statements, I was wondering if you'd be interested in having a face-to-face conversation. No cameras, no recording devices, no publicity. Just two people talking about different ways of looking at life." David read the email 3 times before it sank in. In his entire career of calling out celebrities, religious leaders, and public figures, not one of them had ever responded with an invitation to actually talk. They usually ignored him completely, released defensive statements through their representatives, or occasionally tried to discredit him through their own media appearances. But a personal invitation to sit down and chat? That had never happened. His first instinct was to delete the email and pretend he'd never seen it. This felt like some kind of trap. Maybe it was a setup for a lawsuit, or a way to get him to say something that could be taken out of context later. David's success was built on maintaining distance from his targets. He analyzed them from afar, picked apart their public statements, and exposed their contradictions without ever having to face them as actual human beings. But something about the email nagged at him. The tone was genuinely curious, not defensive. There was no anger in the words, no hurt feelings or wounded pride. It read like someone who was actually interested in understanding David's perspective, which was somehow more unsettling than any angry response would have been. David called his producer, Jake, who had been with the show since the early days. Jake's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Are you kidding me? This is television gold." Jake practically shouted through the phone. "Do you know what kind of ratings we could get from this? We could film the whole thing, make it a 2-part special. Maybe get some hidden cameras, record the audio at least." But David found himself hesitating in a way that surprised him. The email specifically said no cameras, no recording. So? Since when do we care what celebrities want? This guy just handed us the biggest opportunity we've ever had. We can't waste it. David hung up, feeling more confused than before. Jake was right, from a business perspective. This was exactly the kind of content that could take their show to the next level. A face-to-face confrontation with one of Hollywood's most beloved actors would generate months of buzz and probably land them a better network deal. So why was David hesitating? He spent the entire day going back and forth. He drafted response, emails accepting the invitation, then deleted them. He called Jake back twice to discuss strategy, then found himself changing his mind again. By evening, David realized he was facing something he rarely encountered in his carefully controlled world of media criticism: genuine uncertainty. The truth was, David had never actually met any of the people he criticized on his show. He built his arguments from video clips, news articles, and public statements. He knew these people as media personas, not as actual human beings. The idea of sitting across from Keanu Reeves and having an actual conversation felt strangely intimidating. That night, David did something he hadn't done in years. He went back and watched some of Keanu's older interviews, not looking for material to criticize, but just trying to understand what kind of person would respond to public ridicule with a polite invitation to chat. What he found surprised him. In interview after interview, Keanu deflected personal questions with humor but never seemed defensive. When reporters asked about his tragedies, he acknowledged them briefly and then shifted the conversation to other topics. When they pushed him about his beliefs, he spoke carefully and always emphasized that these were just things that helped him personally, not universal truths he was trying to sell. David had to admit, grudgingly, that Keanu didn't fit the typical profile of the spiritual celebrities David usually targeted. He wasn't selling books or courses or retreats. He wasn't claiming to have special knowledge or encouraging others to follow his path. He just occasionally mentioned things that helped him cope with life, usually only when directly asked. But that realization made David even more nervous about meeting him. It's easier to attack someone when you can convince yourself they deserve it. It's harder when you start to suspect they might actually be a decent person who's just trying to get through life like everyone else. 3 days passed before David finally responded to the email. His reply was shorter than Keanu's original message. "I'm willing to talk. When and where?" The response came back within hours, suggesting a small Buddhist temple in Los Angeles the following Saturday morning. The location made David roll his eyes. Of course, Keanu would want to meet on his own turf, surrounded by all the spiritual symbolism that David had spent his career debunking. But he agreed anyway. Jake was furious when David told him about the meeting and his decision to honor Keanu's request for no recording equipment. "You're making the biggest mistake of your career," Jake warned. "What's the point of meeting him if we can't use it for content? Our audience expects us to follow through on these stories." David couldn't explain his reasoning because he didn't fully understand it himself. Maybe it was curiosity about how someone could respond to public humiliation with such grace. Maybe it was the challenge of finally meeting one of his targets face to face. Or maybe, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, David was starting to wonder if his usual approach of analyzing people from a distance might be missing something important. The days leading up to the meeting felt strange. David found himself researching Buddhist temples, not to find ammunition for future criticism, but because he genuinely didn't know what to expect. He'd never been inside any kind of religious building as an adult, having left all that behind. In his teenage years, he also found himself thinking about the email's tone. There had been something in those few simple sentences that David couldn't shake. Most people, when publicly criticized, respond with either anger or defensiveness. But Keanu's invitation felt like it came from genuine curiosity about David's perspective, as if he actually wanted to understand why someone would see his beliefs as problematic. That possibility both intrigued and terrified David. He'd built his entire career on the assumption that people who talked about spirituality were either fooling others or fooling themselves. He'd never seriously considered that some of them might have good reasons for their beliefs, or that they might be open to honest conversation about those reasons. Saturday morning arrived faster than David expected. As he drove toward the temple, he felt more nervous than he had before any television appearance or public debate. This wasn't a performance where he could control the narrative or edit out the parts that didn't work. This was just going to be two people talking, with no audience to impress and no cameras to play to. David had no idea what he was walking into, but for the first time in years, he found himself genuinely curious about what someone else had to say. David Sterling pulled into the parking lot of the Buddhist temple 20 minutes early, his hand still gripping the steering wheel long after he'd turned off the engine. The building looked nothing like what he'd expected. Instead of some grand, exotic structure with golden statues and incense smoke, it was a simple, modest place that could have been mistaken for a community center, if not for the small sign by the entrance. He sat in his car, watching a few people come and go. Most were elderly, moving slowly up the steps with the help of walking canes and each other. A young mother carried her toddler while balancing a bag of what looked like groceries. Nothing about the scene matched the mystical, otherworldly image David had built up in his mind. Then he saw him. Keanu wasn't arriving in some fancy car with tinted windows and a security detail. He was walking up the sidewalk on foot, carrying 2 large paper bags and wearing clothes so ordinary that David almost didn't recognize him. A simple black t-shirt, worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. He looked like any regular guy running errands on a Saturday morning. But what David noticed most was what Keanu was doing as he walked. An elderly woman was struggling with the temple steps, and without any fanfare or announcement, Keanu quickly set down his bags and offered his arm for support. He helped her climb slowly, patiently matching her pace, and even carried her purse for her. Once she was safely inside, he went back for his bags and disappeared through the entrance. David checked his watch. Keanu was 30 minutes early, too. Taking a deep breath, David finally got out of his car and walked toward the temple. As he approached the entrance, he could hear voices and smell something cooking. Through the open door, he could see into a large, simple room where people were setting up tables and arranging chairs. It looked like they were preparing for some kind of community meal. David? He turned around to find Keanu approaching from inside the building. Up close, without the soft lighting of movie screens or interview sets, Keanu looked older and more tired than David had expected. There were lines around his eyes and gray threads in his hair that the cameras usually missed. But his smile seemed genuine, and he extended his hand for a simple handshake. "Thanks for coming," Keanu said. "I wasn't sure you would." David shook, his hand surprised by how normal the moment felt. "To be honest, I wasn't sure either. Would you like to sit outside? It's getting busy in there with lunch prep, and I thought we might want somewhere quieter to talk." They found a small garden area behind the temple, with 2 simple wooden benches facing each other. As they sat down, David felt all the clever opening lines he'd prepared completely disappear from his mind. This wasn't a debate or an interview. It was just 2 people sitting in a garden on a Saturday morning. "I have to ask," David finally said. "Why did you invite me here? Most people in your position would either ignore what I said or have their lawyers send me angry letters." Keanu leaned back slightly, considering the question. "I watched your show and I could tell you'd put a lot of thought into what you were saying. Your concerns seemed genuine, not just mean-spirited. I figured if someone was willing to spend that much time thinking about things I'd said, maybe I should listen to what they had to say." David blinked. This was not the response he'd expected. "You're not angry about what I said about you?" "Angry?" Keanu shook his head. "Why would I be angry? You were questioning ideas, not attacking me personally." "Well, mostly," he added with a slight smile that somehow didn't feel mocking. For the next hour, something happened that David had never experienced in his adult life. Instead of debating or arguing, they just talked. Keanu asked genuine questions about David's journey away from religion, his concerns about spiritual thinking, and his mission to promote rational approaches to life's problems. What struck David most was how carefully Keanu listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't get defensive, and didn't try to change David's mind about anything. When David explained his frustration with people who turned to prayer instead of medicine, or meditation instead of therapy, Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense," Keanu said. "I can see how that would be concerning, especially if you've seen people avoid getting help they really needed." Then Keanu began sharing his own story, but not in the way David had expected. He didn't defend his beliefs or try to convert David to Buddhism. Instead, he talked about his experience with loss and grief in surprisingly practical terms. "When my daughter died," Keanu said quietly, "I did go to therapy. I still do, actually. I took medication for depression. I did all the things that medical professionals recommended. But I was still carrying around this weight, this anger and sadness that felt like it was crushing me." David found himself leaning forward, genuinely curious about what came next. "A friend brought me to a place like this," Keanu continued, gesturing toward the temple. "Not to find religion or convert to anything, but just to sit quietly for a while. The first time I tried meditation, nothing magical happened. I didn't see any bright lights or feel suddenly peaceful. Mostly I just sat there thinking about how much my back hurt. Despite himself, David smiled at that. But after doing it regularly for months, I started noticing something, Keanu went on. The thoughts and feelings were still there, all the grief and anger and confusion. But they didn't control me the same way. It was like learning to watch them from a little bit of distance instead of being completely overwhelmed by them. But couldn't you get the same result from therapy? David asked. I mean, that sounds like cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness-based treatment. Maybe, Keanu said. Probably, actually. I think there's a lot of overlap between what therapists teach and what I learned sitting in temples. The difference for me was the community aspect, the sense of being part of something larger than my own problems. David wanted to argue, to point out the logical flaws in finding comfort in ancient superstitions. But looking at Keanu, seeing how thoughtfully he spoke about his experiences, David found his usual criticism feeling hollow. Here's what I think you might not understand about me, Keanu said, his voice still gentle but more direct. I don't think meditation cured my depression. I don't think Buddhist teachings are scientifically proven solutions to psychological problems. I just found some ideas that help me be a little kinder to myself and other people. That's it. But, when you talk about these things publicly, David said, people look up to you. They might think you're saying that meditation is better than real treatment. You're right, Keanu said, surprising David again. I should be more careful about that when I do interviews. Maybe I should mention more often that I also believe in therapy and medication when they're needed. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching people come and go from the temple. David realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about how to win an argument or score points in a debate. He was just listening to another person share their honest experience. Can I ask you something? Keanu said finally. David nodded. What are you really afraid of when it comes to spiritual thinking? I mean, beyond the concern about people avoiding medical care. The question caught David off guard. He started to give his usual answer about protecting people from false beliefs. But something about the quiet garden and Keanu's genuine curiosity made him pause and think deeper. I think, David said slowly, I'm afraid of people giving up their power to think for themselves. David Sterling drove home from the temple in complete silence, his radio turned off and his phone on silent. The conversation with Keanu kept replaying in his mind, but not in the way he'd expected. Instead of feeling victorious or validated, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine confusion about his own beliefs. For the first time since starting his show, David had met someone who challenged his assumptions without trying to. Keanu hadn't argued with him or defended himself aggressively. He'd simply shared his honest experience and listened to David's concerns with what seemed like real interest. It was the kind of respectful dialogue David had always claimed he wanted, but now that he'd experienced it, he wasn't sure what to do with it. That evening, David sat in his home office staring at his computer screen. He had a show to prepare for Monday night, and his audience would be expecting him to follow up on the Keanu story. They'd want to hear about confronting the actor, exposing his contradictions, maybe even getting him to admit that his spiritual beliefs were just elaborate self-deception. But David couldn't bring himself to write any of that. Instead, he found himself thinking about something Keanu had said during their conversation. When David had asked him about promoting unscientific thinking to millions of fans, Keanu had simply replied, "You're right. I should be more careful about that." No defensiveness, no excuses, just an acknowledgement that David's concern was valid. David couldn't remember the last time someone had responded to his criticism by actually considering it instead of fighting it. The weekend passed slowly. David tried to work on his Monday show, but every draft felt wrong. His usual formula of clips, commentary, and clever takedowns suddenly seemed hollow. He kept hearing Keanu's voice saying, I just found some ideas that help me be a little kinder to myself and other people. That's it. Was that really so terrible? David had spent an hour looking for hidden agendas, manipulation tactics, or signs of fraud. Instead, he'd found a man who seemed genuinely interested in being kind to people and honest about his own struggles. Monday morning arrived, and David still hadn't finished writing his show. His producer, Jake, called twice, increasingly worried about the lack of material. The show's social media accounts were buzzing with fans asking for updates about the Keanu meeting. Everyone was expecting David to deliver the killing blow he'd promised. "I don't think we should do a follow-up episode," David finally told Jake during their afternoon planning meeting. Jake stared at him like he'd just announced he was quitting the show. "What do you mean we're not doing a follow-up? Our audience is expecting it. The ratings from last week were incredible. We have to capitalize on this." "I met with him," David said. "We talked. It wasn't what I expected." "So? Did he admit you were right? Did he say his spiritual stuff was fake? Give me something to work with here." David realized he couldn't explain what had happened at the temple without sounding like he'd lost his mind. How could he tell Jake that he'd spent an hour with Keanu and come away respecting him more, not less? How could he explain that meeting his target face-to-face had made him question whether attacking people's personal beliefs was actually helping anyone? "I need some time to think," David said finally. "Time to think?" Jake's voice was rising. "David, this is television. We don't have time to think. We have a show tomorrow night and an audience that expects us to deliver what we promised." That night, David did something he hadn't done in months. Instead of preparing for his show, he went for a long walk around his neighborhood. No phone, no podcast playing in his earbuds, just his own thoughts for company. As he walked, David started thinking about why he'd gotten into this business in the first place. It wasn't supposed to be about destroying people or making them look foolish. He genuinely wanted to help people think more critically, to question claims that seemed too good to be true, to avoid being taken advantage of by con artists and fraudsters. But somewhere along the way, the mission had changed. The audience loved the takedowns, the social media loved the controversy, and David had found himself becoming more aggressive, more personal in his attacks. He'd started going after anyone who talked about spirituality, whether they were obvious frauds or just regular people trying to make sense of their lives. Tuesday evening came and David walked into his studio knowing he was about to do something that might end his career. His audience was packed, social media was buzzing with anticipation, and everyone was expecting him to deliver the follow-up segment about destroying Keanu Reeves' spiritual credibility. Instead, David opened his show with words no one saw coming. "Good evening, truth seekers. Tonight I want to talk to you about something I learned this week. I want to talk about the difference between questioning dangerous ideas and attacking people for trying to find meaning in their lives." The studio audience fell silent. The online chat room went crazy with confused comments. This wasn't the David Sterling they knew. Last week I did a segment about Keanu Reeves and his public statements about meditation and Buddhist teachings. I spent an hour trying to prove that he was either fooling himself or fooling his fans. I suggested that his charitable work was calculated publicity and that his spiritual beliefs were harmful to his audience. David paused, looking directly into the camera. I was wrong. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, but also strangely liberating. I met with Keanu this weekend. No cameras, no recording devices, just two people having a conversation. And what I found was a man who's dealt with incredible tragedy in his life and found some simple ideas that help him cope with it. He's not selling anything. He's not claiming to have special knowledge, and he's not telling anyone else what to believe. David could see his production team in the control room, frantically trying to figure out what was happening. Jake was making frantic hand signals, probably wondering if David had suffered some kind of breakdown. Here's what I realized, David continued. There's a difference between calling out people who take advantage of others and attacking anyone who finds comfort in ideas that aren't scientifically proven. There's a difference between promoting critical thinking and just being cruel to people who are trying their best to get through life. Over the next 40 minutes, David did something unprecedented in the history of sterling truth. He publicly apologized for his attack on Keanu, explained what he'd learned from their conversation, and talked honestly about how his show had gradually shifted from protecting people to entertaining them at others' expense. I'm not becoming religious, David made clear. I'm still an atheist. I still believe in science and evidence-based thinking. But I also believe in treating people with basic human decency, especially when they're dealing with loss and pain in ways that aren't hurting anyone else. The response was immediate and divided. Half of David's audience felt betrayed, accusing him of going soft or being manipulated by a clever celebrity. But the other half responded with surprising support, sharing their own stories about finding meaning in various beliefs while still valuing rational thinking. More importantly, something had changed in David himself. The anger that had fueled his show for years was still there, but now it was focused more precisely on actual harmful behavior, rather than anyone who thought differently than he did. In the weeks that followed, sterling truth evolved into something different. David still called out obvious fraudsters and dangerous pseudoscience, but he also started having genuine conversations with people who held different beliefs. The show became less about winning arguments and more about understanding different perspectives. The biggest surprise came a month later, when Keanu quietly donated a significant amount of money to a mental health charity that promoted both therapy and meditation as complementary approaches to healing. He never mentioned it publicly, never connected it to his conversation with David, but David knew. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from winning battles, but from discovering that the people we thought were our enemies were just fellow human beings trying to figure out life, one day at a time.